My parents gave me an eviction notice as a birthday gift. But on their anniversary, they lost everything. 25 candles flickered on my untouched birthday cake. I should have known something was wrong when my parents insisted on a family dinner. The Harrisons didn't do celebrations without purpose. Happy birthday, Sophia. Here's your eviction notice. My father's voice carried no emotion as he slid the manila envelope across our mahogany dining table. The same businesslike efficiency he used when terminating employees. This is a joke, right? I asked, though the Harrisons rarely joked. Open it, my mother instructed, her manicured nails tapping impatiently against her wine glass. With trembling fingers, I tore open the envelope. The official letterhead stared back at me. Notice to vacate premises. I don't understand, I whispered, though the truth was dawning with horrifying clarity. My older brother Daniel chuckled, twirling the keys to his new Maserati, his 27th birthday present from last month. It's pretty simple, sis. You're out. We've carried you quite long enough, my mother said coldly. 25 years of investment with absolutely no return. Investment. That's all I had ever been to them. A potential asset that had failed to appreciate. But I just finished my MBA, I protested, my voice embarrassingly small in our cavernous dining room. You said once you graduated, you'd prove your worth, my father interrupted, checking his Rolex. Your grades were acceptable, but you've shown no initiative. Daniel had already secured 3 major clients for the firm by your age. I looked at my brother, searching for even a flicker of sympathy. Daniel had been my childhood protector once. Now he merely smirked. You can't just throw me out, I said, a spark of defiance igniting. This is my home too. Actually, my father replied, this house and everything in it belongs to Harrison Holdings, of which you are no longer a beneficiary. He slid another document toward me. You've been removed from the family trust, effective immediately. The world tilted beneath me. The trust was my safety net, my future, my birthright. What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go? My voice cracked despite my efforts to remain composed. My mother sighed dramatically. Perhaps you should have considered these questions before wasting your potential. She rose from her chair, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her designer dress. You're not cut out for this family anyway. You never had the Harrison drive. I felt hollow, dressed in the birthday outfit I'd carefully selected that morning, a conservative blue dress I knew my mother would approve of. How desperate I'd been for their approval. When? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Tonight, my father replied, already scrolling through emails on his phone. Security will ensure you take only your personal belongings. Nothing purchased with family funds. My mother paused at the dining room threshold. Consider this a favor, Sophia. The real world doesn't reward mediocrity. Perhaps necessity will finally motivate you to excel. As she disappeared, I turned to Daniel. Did you know about this? He shrugged, popping a piece of my birthday cake into his mouth. Course I did. Who do you think suggested it? Your dead weight, Sophie. Always have been. The betrayal cut deeper than I expected. Daniel and I had grown apart, but I never imagined he'd orchestrated my expulsion. You won't last a month out there, he added with casual cruelty. But don't worry. When you come crawling back, begging for scraps, I'll make sure security knows your face. Alone in the dining room, I stared at the documents that had shattered my world. Tears threatened, but I refused to let them fall. Crying was weakness, and weakness was unbecoming of a Harrison, even a disowned one. In my bedroom, a space decorated to reflect sophisticated young womanhood, I grabbed a suitcase from my closet. What does one pack when their entire life is being erased? I took only what was undeniably mine. Clothes purchased with birthday money from distant relatives, a few pieces of costume jewelry, my laptop, and a dog-eared copy of Jane Eyre that had been my grandmother's. My eyes fell on the family portrait hanging on my wall. I removed it from its hook, studying our perfect facades. My father's commanding posture, my mother's calculated elegance, Daniel's confident smirk, and me, trying so hard to belong. With surprising calm, I removed the photograph from its frame and tore it precisely down the middle, separating myself from the family that had just done the same. I left the torn pieces on my perfectly made bed. Downstairs, our security chief, a man who had once sneaked me cookies when I was little, avoided my eyes as he escorted me to the door. "I'm sorry, Miss Sophia," he murmured quietly. "I have to check your bags." "It's okay, Frank," I replied, suddenly feeling sorry for him. I didn't take anything that wasn't mine. After inspection, he handed me an envelope. "The company car has been reassigned. This is for a taxi." I stared at the money, a final insult wrapped in the thinnest veneer of courtesy. With nowhere to go, I left that mansion carrying nothing but a suitcase of inadequate belongings and the last shreds of my dignity. I didn't take the taxi money. As the wrought iron gates closed behind me, I felt something unexpected beneath my grief and shock, a flicker of relief. For the first time in 25 years, I was free from the weight of their impossible expectations. I just didn't know yet what that freedom would cost me. The first night of my new life, I slept on a bench in Central Park. Not my proudest moment, but pride was a luxury I could no longer afford. By morning, I had exactly $237 to my name, the cash in my wallet and nothing more. My credit cards were corporate accounts, already deactivated. My bank account was a family trust subsidiary, now frozen. I was Sophia Harrison without the Harrison. My first call was to Megan, my roommate from college. "Just for a few nights," I promised, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Until I figure things out." 3 days turned into 3 weeks on her pull-out couch. I applied for every job I could find, my MBA suddenly worthless, without the Harrison name to back it. No one wanted to hire the disgraced daughter who couldn't even hold her family's approval. "You should call them," Megan suggested one night, watching me stare at apartment listings I couldn't afford. "Just apologize for whatever happened." "I didn't do anything wrong," I said, the words bitter on my tongue. "Doesn't matter with families like yours," she replied, the truth of her words stinging. "Pride won't pay your rent." But pride was all I had left. When Megan's boyfriend moved in, I moved out. I found a dingy studio apartment in a neighborhood my mother would call transitional. The kind of place where sirens were lullabies and roaches were roommates. I paid the security deposit with my last dollars and changed my name to Sophia Gray. Not legally, that would come later, but in practice. I couldn't bear the weight of a name that no longer wanted me. I found work waiting tables at a diner where the manager didn't care about background checks or resumes. 12-hour shifts left my feet blistered and my back aching, but the tips kept me fed. Barely. 6 months after my eviction, I hit rock bottom. The restaurant closed without warning, leaving me jobless. My landlord threatened eviction when I was 3 days late with rent. As I sat on my threadbare mattress, contemplating calling Daniel to beg for help, a notification lit up my phone. "Free digital marketing workshop tonight." I almost didn't go. What was the point? But desperation makes decisions that pride would never consider. The workshop was held in a community college classroom that smelled like floor cleaner and instant coffee. The instructor, a scrappy entrepreneur named Raj, spoke with the confidence of someone who had built something from nothing. "Digital marketing isn't magic," he told the sparse audience. "It's strategy, psychology, and persistence. 3 things anyone can learn." For the first time in months, I felt a spark of possibility. This was something I could do without connections or family backing. I stayed after class, peppered Raj with questions until the janitor kicked us out. Instead of being annoyed, he seemed impressed. "You think differently," he said, scribbling his email on a napkin. "Send me your ideas for the case study we discussed. If they're good, I might have some freelance work." That night, I worked until sunrise, pouring everything I had learned from my business degree into a marketing plan for his client's struggling bakery. 3 days later, Raj hired me as a part-time consultant. It wasn't much, a few $100s a month, but it was something built with my own hands. Something no one could take away. I kept waitressing, adding bartending on weekends. Every spare moment went into learning SEO, content strategy, analytics. I built websites for local businesses at prices they could afford. My client list grew slowly, solely through results and word of mouth. A year after my birthday disaster, I registered Gray Marketing LLC. My first official business, funded by 12 months of ramen dinners and missed rent payments. 2 years in, I landed my first major client, a struggling local brewery that larger agencies had written off. Their sales increased 200% after my campaign. They referred me to others. The snowball began to roll. I hired my first employee in year 3, a coding genius who believed in my vision. We moved into a real office, a tiny space above a laundromat, but it was ours. Through it all, I heard whispers about the Harrisons. Former classmates would mention them, unaware of my connection. Daniel had taken over more of the business. My father was stepping back. Their company was expanding aggressively, acquiring smaller firms at a pace that raised eyebrows. I didn't care. Or at least, that's what I told myself as I worked 18-hour days building my company brick by brick. Until the day Raj, now my business mentor and friend, forwarded me an article from the financial press. "Isn't this your brother?" The subject line read. Daniel's smug face stared back at me from the screen. The headline made my blood run cold. Harrison Heirs' risky ventures raise questions about family empire's future. Something shifted inside me. A cold clarity I'd never felt before. I wasn't just building a life anymore. I was building ammunition. 5 years after my exile, I sat in my corner office overlooking Manhattan, reviewing Gray Marketing's quarterly earnings. We'd grown from a one-woman operation to a team of 37, with clients spanning 3 continents. The industry magazine on my desk featured us as the disruptor agency to watch. I should have been satisfied. I had proven them wrong. Built something valuable without the Harrison name or connections. But the wound never fully healed. It just scabbed over, ready to bleed at the slightest provocation. My assistant knocked and entered without waiting, her face flushed with excitement. "Sophia, you need to see this." She placed her tablet in front of me. The headline made my coffee turn bitter in my mouth. Harrison Holdings facing liquidity crisis amid failed acquisitions. The article detailed what insiders were calling catastrophic missteps by Daniel Harrison, who had leveraged the company to dangerous levels, acquiring businesses he didn't understand at inflated prices. 3 consecutive quarters of losses had spooked investors. Their stock had plummeted 67% in 6 months. "Didn't you once mention you interned there in college?" my assistant asked innocently. "Something like that," I murmured, already scanning the financial details. The numbers told a story more satisfying than any revenge fantasy I'd entertained during my darkest nights. My once mighty parents were on the brink of losing everything. Their perfect son, the one they'd worshipped, the one they'd sacrificed me for, had run their empire into the ground. Their debts were piling up. Asset liquidation had begun. I closed the browser and stared out at the skyline. I had built my success honestly, through talent and relentless work. Daniel had inherited his position and squandered it through arrogance and entitlement. The poetic justice should have been enough. I should have let karma finish what it started. But then my phone rang. "Ms. Gray? This is Calvin Weber from Prestige Auctions. I'm calling about an estate coming to auction next month that might interest you, given your company's recent property acquisitions." I nearly hung up until he mentioned the address, my childhood home. The sprawling mansion where I'd spent 25 years trying to earn love that was never on offer. "The Harrison estate?" I asked, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hand. "Yes, foreclosure proceedings have been completed. The property will be available to qualified bidders on March 15th. March 15th. My parents' wedding anniversary. The coincidence was almost too perfect. "Send me the details," I said before ending the call. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I researched my family. What I found confirmed everything the article had suggested, and worse. Daniel had driven Harrison Holdings to the edge of bankruptcy. My father had suffered a stress-induced heart attack and stepped down entirely. My mother was selling her jewelry collection piecemeal. Their perfect life was disintegrating, just as mine had 5 years earlier. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow. What was the point of success if there was no one to witness your triumph? What good was karma if your enemies didn't know it was their own actions returning to haunt them? The next morning, I called my financial advisor. I want to create a new holding company, I said. Completely separate from gray marketing. Anonymous ownership. Tax purposes? He asked, already taking notes. Something like that. I named it Phoenix Capital, risen from ashes. Its first acquisition would be the Harrison estate. As the auction approached, I made careful preparations. I hired a private investigator to track my family's movements. I learned they were desperately trying to raise funds to buy back the house. Daniel had apparently promised investors he could turn things around if they just had 6 more months in their family home, as if the mansion itself held some magical power to undo his catastrophic decisions. 2 days before the auction, my investigator delivered his final report with an unexpected detail. My parents were hosting a small gathering on the evening after the auction, their anniversary celebration. A last hurrah before they potentially lost everything. The guest list included only their closest friends and the investors Daniel was courting. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. They would lose their home on the very day they celebrated their union. The family they had built, the family they had deemed me unworthy of. I stood in front of my closet the morning of the auction, selecting my armor carefully. Not the power suits I wore to intimidate competitors, or the casual elegance I adopted with clients. Something they would recognize, a blue dress, similar to the one I'd worn the night they cast me out. Poetic, I murmured to my reflection. As my driver navigated toward the auction house, I felt strangely calm. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice, about closing a chapter that had been left painfully open. The auctioneer's gavel was about to become the period at the end of the Harrison family's sentence, and I would be the one to put it there. The auction house buzzed with vultures and expensive suits, all hoping to snatch prime real estate at bargain prices. I slipped into a seat at the back, sunglasses obscuring my face. 5 years and a complete transformation of my circumstances had changed my appearance enough that I wasn't worried about immediate recognition, but I wasn't ready to reveal myself. Not yet. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of them. My mother sat rigidly in the front row, her once perfect posture now strained with tension. The Chanel suit she wore, one I recognized from years ago, hung slightly loose on her frame. Beside her, my father looked diminished, his commanding presence reduced to an old man clutching a bidding paddle like a lifeline. Daniel stood off to the side, pacing while furiously typing on his phone. I could read the desperation in every movement. He'd gambled their legacy and lost, and now he was scrambling for a miracle. Today's highlight is the Harrison estate, the auctioneer announced, his voice carrying practiced enthusiasm. A stunning 7-bedroom property on 2 acres in Westchester County. We'll start the bidding at $3.2 million. My father's paddle shot up immediately. I watched as several other bidders joined. With each higher bid, my mother's shoulders tensed further. By $3.8 million, my father's face had turned an alarming shade of red. $4 million, he called out, his voice strained. An audible murmur rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the property was worth nearly double that in normal circumstances. The auctioneer nodded. I have $4 million. Do I hear $4.10? A real estate developer in the second row raised his paddle. $4.1 million. My father hesitated, consulting a notepad. Even from a distance, I could read his body language. That was his limit. They had scraped together every remaining dollar, called in every favor, and $4 million was all they had. $4.1 million going once. My father's hands trembled. My mother whispered something urgently in his ear. Going twice. Daniel abandoned his phone call, rushing to his parents. Too late. $6 million, I called out clearly, removing my sunglasses. The room fell silent. Even the auctioneer seemed startled by the massive jump. $6 million from the lady in blue, he confirmed after collecting himself. Do I hear $6.1 million? No one moved. At that price, the property was no longer a steal, even for developers planning to subdivide. Going once, going twice, sold to bidder number 194. I stood and made my way to the front to complete the paperwork. As I passed the family row, I felt their eyes on me, confusion slowly giving way to recognition. My mother gasped first. "Sophia?" I turned, meeting her gaze directly for the first time in 5 years. "Hello, Mother." My father staggered to his feet, his face ashen. "What are you doing here?" "Buying a house," I replied simply, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I've been in the market for an investment property." Daniel pushed between them, his handsome face contorted with rage and disbelief. "This is some kind of joke. There's no way you have that kind of money." I smiled. "Phoenix Capital has that kind of money. I'm merely its CEO." I savored his confusion. He'd never bothered to research me after my exile, never bothered to learn what I'd built from the ashes of the life they'd burned down. "Ms. Gray?" The auctioneer's assistant approached hesitantly. "If you'll follow me to complete the purchase." My mother's eyes widened at the name. "Gray?" "Sophia Gray," I confirmed. I found the Harrison name limiting. "You can't do this," Daniel hissed, grabbing my arm. "That's our family home." I looked pointedly at his hand until he released me. "It was. Now it's mine. Legally. Completely." The same words my father had used in countless business dealings. The same words they'd used when evicting me. "We need to talk," my father said, his businessman instincts finally kicking in. "I'm sure we can come to some arrangement that's mutually beneficial." "Actually," I replied, checking my watch, "I have a closing to complete. But I'll be in touch about the transition of ownership." As I walked away, my mother called after me, her voice cracking. "Sophia, please. It's our anniversary today. Have some compassion." I paused, looking back at the woman who had shown me none. "Happy anniversary, Mother. Consider this my gift. A chance to start over with nothing." It worked wonders for me. The auctioneer's office was quiet and efficient. As I signed the final document transferring ownership, I felt a strange sense of completion. The house that had been my prison and then my heartbreak was now my possession. Outside, my driver waited with the car door open. As I approached, I saw them huddled near the entrance, my broken family, watching me with a mixture of shock, anger, and dawning fear. I had prepared for this moment for years, rehearsed what I'd say when I finally held all the cards. But seeing them there, diminished, desperate, I realized I didn't need elaborate speeches. I simply smiled and slipped into my car. From the window, I watched their expressions shift as my driver pulled away. They hadn't seen the cruelest irony yet. That would come when they returned home to celebrate their anniversary and found my eviction notice waiting. 3 hours after the auction, I sat in my downtown penthouse reviewing the final ownership documents when my assistant buzzed through. "Ms. Gray, there are 3 people in the lobby insisting on seeing you. They say they're your family." Of course they'd found me. It wouldn't have been difficult. Gray marketing wasn't exactly low profile anymore. "Send them up," I said, arranging myself behind my desk. This confrontation was inevitable. Better to have it on my terms, in my territory. When they entered, I was struck by how small they seemed. My father, once the towering figure who could silence a room with his presence, now stooped slightly. My mother's carefully maintained facade showed cracks. Her makeup couldn't hide the exhaustion around her eyes. Daniel alone maintained his arrogance, though it seemed more desperate than confident now. "Impressive," my father said, looking around my office with appraising eyes. "You've done well for yourself." "No thanks to you," I replied evenly. My mother stepped forward, her voice softening to the tone she'd used when charming potential clients. "Sophia, darling, we've been so worried about you. All these years, wondering where you were, if you were safe." "Spare me," I interrupted. "You never looked for me. Not once." My private investigator had confirmed this. No missing person reports, no private detectives hired, not even a cursory search of social media. "We gave you space," my father claimed. "We thought that's what you needed." Daniel snorted. Even he couldn't stomach that lie. I leaned back in my chair. "What do you want? I'm sure it's not a family reunion." My father straightened, slipping into negotiation mode. "We'd like to discuss an arrangement regarding the house. Perhaps a leaseback option? We could pay rent." "With what money?" I asked. Your company stock is nearly worthless. Your assets are being liquidated to cover Daniel's catastrophic decisions. Daniel flushed. The market turned against us. It was bad timing, not bad business. It was hubris, I corrected. The same hubris that led you to believe you could throw me away like garbage and face no consequences. My mother's eyes welled with carefully timed tears. Sophia, we made a terrible mistake. We see that now. You've proven yourself beyond anything we could have imagined. And that's supposed to make it better? I asked. That you only see my worth now that I'm successful? She flinched. For a brief moment, I saw genuine regret cross her face, quickly masked by the calculated charm she'd perfected over decades of social climbing. What happened to you was unfortunate, my father conceded, choosing his words with lawyer-like precision. But surely you can see that holding on to bitterness serves no one. We're still your family. No, I said quietly. You lost the right to call yourselves that 5 years ago. On my birthday, if you recall. A heavy silence fell over the room. My father's jaw worked as he struggled to find the right angle. My mother dabbed at eyes that remained perfectly dry beneath her performance. Daniel, never one for patience, cut to the chase. How much? Excuse me? How much to make this go away, he demanded. To sell us back our house? Name your price. We know it's not about the money for you. I smiled. You're right about that, at least. Then what do you want? My father asked, frustration bleeding through his control. Revenge? Is that it? To see us suffer? The irony was breathtaking. No, father. I want justice. There's a difference. This isn't justice, Daniel sneered. This is you being a vindictive bitch. Daniel, my mother hissed, but the damage was done. I stood slowly. I think we're done here. We're not leaving until we have an agreement, my father insisted, the old authority creeping back into his voice. Actually, you are, I replied, pressing the intercom. Security, please escort my visitors out. My mother dropped all pretense now, her voice shrill with panic. Sophia, please. It's our home. We have nowhere else to go. I had nowhere to go on my 25th birthday. I reminded her coldly. You didn't seem concerned then. As security arrived, my father made one last attempt. We can fix this, Sophia. We can be a family again. Whatever you want, a position in the company, recognition. The company you ran into the ground? I laughed without humor. No, thank you. My mother lunged forward, gripping my desk with manicured hands. Sophia, sweetheart, we can explain everything. This is all a misunderstanding. Daniel scoffed, destroying her performance. Oh, cut the crap, mother. She's not buying it. He turned to me, his eyes narrowing. You think you've won, don't you? You think this makes us even? I looked at him calmly. I'm not better than you, Daniel. I just learned how to survive without stepping on others. As security led them toward the door, my mother called out one last desperate plea. It's not just the house. It's everything we have left. Your father's heart can't take this stress. Have mercy, Sophia. For a fleeting moment, I wavered. Then I remembered the cold calculation in her eyes the night they cast me out. The way Daniel had suggested my expulsion. My father's indifference to my fate. You have 2 weeks to vacate the premises, I said, turning away. I suggest you don't waste time begging. When they were gone, I stood at my window overlooking the city, watching people flow through the streets below. Tiny lives, all with their own dramas and heartbreaks. 4 or 5 years, I'd been one of them. Anonymous, struggling, determined. The victory felt hollow. I had everything I'd worked for. Success, vindication, justice. Why then did it feel like I'd lost something in the process? My assistant knocked softly. The eviction papers you requested are ready for delivery. I took the envelope from her. The symmetry was perfect. They would receive it tonight, during their anniversary party. The same cruel timing they'd chosen for me. Justice demanded nothing less, didn't it? The sun was setting when my car pulled up to the Harrison estate, my estate now. Golden light washed over the landscaped grounds, the same grounds I'd wandered as a child, always careful not to disturb my mother's precious gardens. Through the windows, I could see movement inside. Their anniversary celebration was underway, though from the sparse number of cars in the driveway, it seemed many of their so-called friends had abandoned them in their downfall. The wealthy rarely stay loyal to the falling. I instructed my driver to wait and approached the door alone, the manila envelope containing the eviction notice heavy in my hand. Frank, the security chief who had escorted me out 5 years ago, opened the door. His eyes widened in recognition. "Miss Sophia," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder. "I didn't know you were expected." "I'm not," I replied, "but I need to deliver this." He hesitated, then stepped aside. Some loyalties, it seemed, could shift when fortunes changed. I walked through the foyer toward the dining room, heels clicking on marble floors that had once been forbidden to me unless I was dressed appropriately. The house smelled the same, my mother's preferred orchids, furniture polish, and the lingering scent of old money. Voices drifted from the dining room, strained attempts at normalcy. I paused at the threshold, observing the scene before anyone noticed me. My parents sat at opposite ends of the table, as tradition dictated. Between them, instead of the usual 20 guests, sat only 5, Daniel and 4 older men I recognized as potential investors. My mother was mid-anecdote, a practiced smile fixed on her face. And that's when I told the ambassador, "Darling, one simply doesn't wear emeralds to a noon luncheon." The weak laughter that followed died instantly when Daniel spotted me. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, rising so abruptly his chair toppled backward. All heads turned. My mother's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the table. "Sophia," my father began, struggling to his feet. "Gentlemen, please excuse us for a moment." "No need," I said, stepping into the room. "I won't be staying. I just came to deliver this." I placed the envelope beside my mother's plate. She stared at it as if it might bite her. "What is this?" she whispered. "Open it," I instructed, echoing her words from my birthday. With trembling fingers, she tore the envelope open. The official letterhead of my law firm, not my father's, stared back at her, followed by the bold words at the top. "Notice to vacate premises." "You can't be serious," my father said, his voice a mix of disbelief and resignation. "Completely serious," I replied. "You have 2 weeks to remove your belongings. Anything left behind becomes property of the new owner." The investors exchanged uncomfortable glances. Daniel lunged forward, but one of the older men caught his arm. "Is this how you handle family matters, Ms. Harrison?" one investor asked disapprovingly. "It's Ms. Gray," I corrected. "And yes, this is exactly how the Harrisons handle family matters. Isn't that right, Mother?" My mother's facade crumbled completely. For the first time in my life, I saw her stripped of pretense, just a frightened old woman who had lost everything. "We were wrong," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What we did to you was unforgivable. But this is cruel, Sophia." Cruel? The word hung in the air between us. Was it cruel when you threw me out with nowhere to go? Was it cruel when Daniel suggested cutting me off completely? Was it cruel when Father couldn't even look me in the eye as he destroyed my life? The room fell silent. The investors were watching the scene unfold with morbid fascination. "Your father's heart condition," my mother began desperately, "is not my concern." I finished coldly, though something twisted inside me. "You made sure of that when you severed all ties." Daniel slammed his fist on the table. "You've made your point. You've humiliated us. Isn't that enough?" I looked at him, my brother, my childhood protector turned betrayer. "It's not about humiliation, Daniel. It's about consequences. Something you've managed to avoid your entire life." The oldest investor stood, buttoning his jacket. "I believe we've seen enough. Richard, Margaret, this is clearly a bad time. We'll be in touch." The investors filed out, taking with them Daniel's last hope of salvation. His face contorted with rage. "You bitch. Do you have any idea what you've done? That was our last chance to save the company." I felt nothing at his outburst. "You destroyed the company all on your own, just like you destroyed this family." My father sank heavily into his chair, one hand clutching his chest. For a moment, fear flickered through me. Was my mother telling the truth about his heart?
Dad.
Daniel's anger instantly transformed to concern as he rushed to our father's side. I watched as my father waved him away, breathing deeply. "I'm fine," he managed, though his complexion suggested otherwise. In that moment, seeing them together, Daniel's genuine worry, my father's vulnerability, I felt a strange sense of disconnection. These people who had shaped my entire existence, who had wounded me so deeply, suddenly seemed like strangers. "The eviction stands," I said quietly. 2 weeks. As I turned to leave, my mother called after me one last time. "What happened to you, Sophia? You were never this cold." I paused at the doorway, looking back at the remnants of my former family. "I learned from the best, Mother." Walking back to my car, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only an overwhelming sense of finality. The cycle was complete. I had taken everything from them, just as they had taken everything from me. My driver opened the door, and I slid into the cool leather interior. As we pulled away from the house, I watched it recede in the rearview mirror, the place where I was born, raised, and discarded. I had built my own empire, and they had destroyed theirs. That was karma. That was justice. And yet, as the gates closed behind us, I realized the most important thing I'd built wasn't my company or my wealth. It was my freedom from their expectations, their conditional love, and now, finally, from the need for their approval. I deleted their contact information from my phone and never looked back.